Hey, what's going on, everybody? My name is TJ Jones, and welcome to the TJ Knows Wrestling Podcast. Thank you so much for checking this podcast out. And on this episode, we're going to be talking about a very controversial figure, but nevertheless, he will go down in history as one of the greatest technical wrestlers of all time. And I'm referring to Chris Benoit. Now, anytime you mention Chris Benoit in the world of professional wrestling these days, you got to cringe a little bit. And I'm going to be honest with you. I was kind of on the fence on if I wanted to do a video on Chris Benoit, but I decided to, even though it's kind of hard to do, remove what actually happened from the actual guy. Because any interview that you see, you always hear wrestlers talking about if I could pick a guy out of the lineup and be the last guy to do something like what Benoit did, he would be the last person they'll pick. So I tried to, separate the two, just like some of those other wrestlers do. So we're going to be talking about Chris Benoit and what he contributed to the world of professional wrestling. But let's go ahead and start off with the profile of Chris Benoit. Chris Benoit was born Christopher Michael Benoit on May 21st, 1967 in Montreal, Quebec, Canada. And we all know that Chris Benoit, growing up as a kid, his father bought him the weight set, and he began to bodybuild. And the person that he idolized, watching wrestling was the Dynamite Kid, right? The Dynamite Kid, one half of the British Bulldogs, along with the British Bulldog, Davey Boy Smith. Chris Benoit idolized the guy. And later on in his career, he pretty much adopted his entire move set. And a lot of people compared Chris Benoit to the Dynamite Kid because of their size, as well as, the way that they actually looked. He was basically the spitting image of the Dynamite Kid. But growing up in Canada, Chris Benoit wasn't the tallest person in the world for those that follow him. Probably was about 5'9", 5'10". But, he was probably in his earlier years between 180 to 200 pounds. And he first started out in Stampede Wrestling. That's right. He started out in Stampede Wrestling out there in Canada. We know that Stampede Wrestling was owned and operated by the Hart family, the patriarch of the Hart family, Stu Hart, and where all the legendary Hart children actually honed their craft, right? Bret the Hitman Hart, Owen Hart, Bruce Hart, or what have you. So Chris Benoit started off in Stampede Wrestling. He got his start. He was really technically sound. Once again, adopting the skill set and the style of the Dynamite Kid. And he wrestled there for a few years, and then he moved on to where he really got his name was in New Japan Pro Wrestling. He goes overseas to Japan, and he studies in a Japanese dojo for about a year, adopting the style. Like we all hear about the classic Japanese style is completely different from the American style. Well, Chris Benoit kind of, mastered that. And that's where he really got his physicality from, in a mixture of the technical ability. So you look at his first two stops, right? Stampede Wrestling, where, you got Bret Hart, Owen Hart. I mean, learn the technical style, and then you got the strong style of the Japanese, and you roll that all up. And as you can see, like he was definitely starting to build up his craft. But he goes to New Japan, and he starts to wrestle under the mask as the Wild Pegasus. He didn't like the mask at first. He talked about this all the time about how he wasn't a fan of wearing a mask. But eventually, it kind of grew on him, because he became, the Wild Pegasus. He embodied the whole entire character. And he wrestled there for quite some time, man, putting on classic matches with legendary Japanese wrestler Jushin Thunder Liger. I know some of you probably heard of him before. The Black Tiger, also known as Eddie Guerrero. Over there in Japan, that's where Eddie Guerrero and Chris Benoit developed their friendship because of some of their classic matches they had under the mask. So Chris Benoit stayed there for quite some time, man. But Chris Benoit ended up going back to the States to wrestle for the first time in WCW. But he wrestled in WCW because of the Japanese contractual agreement between them and WCW. And he came back and he wrestled for the NWA Tag Team Championship Tournament. Okay. And he wrestled there, and he didn't win it. It was unsuccessful along with him and his tag team partner. And he was wrestling, in Japan most of the time. But anyway, he ends up going back to Japan, having a good little run. But I guess he decides to come back to the States for the final time. Okay, so he comes back and he enters ECW. Okay, ECW, which is Extreme Championship Wrestling, owned and operated at that time by Paul Heyman. And he took off the mask. He was no longer wearing a mask. He was no longer the Wild Pegasus. And we know Chris Benoit for being this intense technical wrestler, man. And he went into ECW with that same mind frame. And what was his greatest moment in ECW? Probably would have to be when he wrestled Sabu and he ended up breaking Sabu's neck. And even though he did it by mistake, it was an accident. Paul Heyman wanted Chris Benoit to do all these very intense personal promos and talk about how he intentionally tried to break Sabu's neck, and he dubbed himself the Crippler for the very first time. And that's something that we knew him as. You know, his nickname was the Crippler, Chris Benoit. He got that name for breaking Sabu's neck. So that's where he got the whole Crippler name from, ECW, where he just became this intense wrestler, having some very classic matches with Eddie Guerrero, Dean Malenko, and to finally, they became a tag team. And, he wrestled there for a little while, but eventually he left, probably mostly because of money. ECW was a popular wrestling organization, but it was pretty much minor league. So he decides to leave, go to greener pastures. He enters once again WCW as a singles superstar. Remember, the first time he had a tag team partner. This time he was a part of WCW as a single star. So Chris Benoit, man, he did a really good job in WCW. I mean, he really put on some really good matches, man. I could just remember some of his matches that he had with Booker T, man. That's one that stands out to me, the best of 7 series. I think it helped both men. It was for the television championship, Chris Benoit and Booker T. And for those that never watched Booker T versus Chris Benoit, the best of 7 series, you're doing yourself a great injustice if you never check that out, man. There was some classic matches. And like I said, both of them actually elevated themselves because of those matches. Also, man, just Chris Benoit, going around winning the television championship, winning the United States championship. And, the fourth wall was basically broken in one of his storylines, right? Kevin Sullivan, for some of you probably know, you probably remember Kevin Sullivan. I think he was part of the Varsity Club back in the day with Mike Rotunda. Mike Rotunda, you probably know him as IRS. And if you don't know him as IRS, just know that he's Bray Wyatt's and Bo Dallas's father, okay? He was a part of the Varsity Club. And then finally, Kevin Sullivan was a part of the Dungeon of Doom, where, they were trying to destroy Hulkamania. I mean, terrible stuff. But nevertheless, Kevin Sullivan was one of the best minds in the business, and he worked himself up all the way to being the booker. And for those that don't know what a booker is, that's the person that organizes the matches, right? The wins and the losses or whatever like that. They're the ones that put all the matches together. So at this time, Kevin Sullivan was married to Woman, right? Woman was a valet. Probably remember her from being with the Four Horsemen. And she was married to Kevin Sullivan. But Kevin Sullivan came up with the idea of putting Woman with Chris Benoit, right? So Woman ended up being the valet for Chris Benoit because Kevin Sullivan wanted him to. And in the process, Woman and Chris Benoit end up getting into a extramarital affair. I mean, so a lot of people look at Kevin Sullivan and they kind of snicker a little bit because they say he actually booked his own divorce, right? Because he actually booked his wife with Chris Benoit. And in the process, they started messing around with each other. So, I mean, it became very, very personal. Once again, the fourth wall was open because these two guys were actually fighting each other in some of the most intense matches you're ever going to find. A lot of street fights, a lot of one-on-one matches, and these guys were really going at it to a point where after the match was over, they still were fighting in the back. And it was just really, really personal stuff. But nevertheless, Kevin Sullivan and Woman, Nancy Benoit, they end up getting a divorce. Her and Chris Benoit end up being together. All right. And, Chris Benoit stayed in WCW for a little bit longer, probably about 3 or 4 years after this historic feud with Kevin Sullivan, really just under the ranks. He was part of the Four Horsemen, a new Four Horsemen with Arn Anderson, Ric Flair, Mongo McMichaels. I don't know what the hell they was thinking with that. But anyway, He was part of the Four Horsemen, man. So WCW really had a lot of big plans for him, but he was always flying under the radar, man. Never was in championship contention because this was during the time when the NWO was running wild, and everybody wanted to be in the NWO, and Hulk Hogan was champion every single time. And we know the story if you've been following wrestling, but Chris Benoit was always like the mid-card guy. He was always the guy that was putting on really, really classic matches, man. And but you can tell like he was extremely unhappy at this time. He was just out there being a bold soldier, collecting that Skrilla or that money. And, he was just buying his time. I think the last match I can remember Chris Benoit was when Bret the Hitman Hart left WWF at the time and came to WCW, and they had a classic match the night, in the same building in Kansas City where Owen Hart lost his life tragically to a bungee accident. And some of you probably already, know about that story. Over the Edge pay-per-view, Owen Hart falls to his death. Chris Benoit and Bret the Big Hitman Hart have a tribute match to Owen Hart in Kansas City, and it was a classic match. That's probably the last match I can remember of any type of significance that Chris Benoit had. But finally, WCW decides to put the scrap on Chris Benoit, right? And he has a match with Kevin Nash for the World Heavyweight Championship. And he ends up winning. No, I won't say Kevin Nash. I'm sorry, Sid Vicious. He ends up having a match with Sid Vicious, and he ends up beating Sid for the WCW Championship, right? The match was actually booked by Kevin Nash, who was the booker at the time. Okay, so anyway, he ends up winning the championship, but at this particular time, I mean, the doors are basically closed. Okay, Chris Benoit understands that WCW is a train wreck. I mean, there was in between ownership, in between people running and operating the business, and him along with Eddie Guerrero, Perry Saturn, and Dean Malenko, they were frustrated, man. So they decided to call up New York, get in touch with WWF personnel, and they end up getting a deal with WWF. So they left him being a world champion. He didn't get beat. He just relinquished the championship, left. And he, Perry Saturn, Dean Malenko, and Eddie Guerrero, we found them a couple nights later sitting in the front row of a WWF event, and they became the Radicals, right? A faction together. And Chris Benoit was the leader of the group. And they had some really good matches, man. But, they were actually buried when they first got there, man. I can remember, I think it was on SmackDown, where all members of the Radicals had to go up against members of WWF, right? You had Chris Benoit taking on Triple H. You had Dean Malenko wrestle somebody, but everybody lost, okay? So basically, they buried them on their way through the door. But nevertheless, these guys were able to, get a career going, right? So Chris Benoit ended up having like a little brief stint, with Shane McMahon. He became a heel, and I can remember this whole thing proved me wrong. That was like his first slogan, and he was wrestling some of the top stars, man. He was in there. He was in there with The Rock. I can remember that. You know what I'm saying? I can remember him wrestling for the Intercontinental Championship, which he won. You know what I'm saying? He had like some classic feuds. Like out of all the other guys that came in with him, Chris Benoit was the one that hit the ground running. It seems like WWF really appreciated his talent at the time. All right, but at the same time, you had Chris Benoit wrestling some of these classic matches, but they end up having the draft, right? And you had some of the wrestlers going to Raw, some of the wrestlers going to SmackDown. So Paul Heyman was taking over SmackDown as one of the head writers and the head organizers at that time, along with Stephanie McMahon. And people didn't look at SmackDown as a top show, right? They just looked at it as just this secondary show. And say Raw is the main ticket. This is the one that's going to be making the money. But Paul Heyman took it as a challenge. So Paul Heyman asked for Eddie Guerrero. He asked for Kurt Angle. He asked for Chris Benoit. He asked for Edge, and he asked for Rey Mysterio. And we all know how good SmackDown was at the time. Them putting on some really good matches. Remember the United States tournament, the final match, Chris Benoit versus Eddie Guerrero. Eddie Guerrero ends up winning the United States Championship. But nevertheless, I mean, he was just plugging and playing these feuds, man. I mean, these guys were having these outrageous, crazy matches, man, that were just absolutely awesome. And it was ticking a lot of people on the Raw brand off because it wasn't supposed to be that good. But one of the catalysts for the success of SmackDown in the early stages was Chris Benoit. Chris Benoit having classic matches with people like Kurt Angle. All right. I remember their match at the Royal Rumble one year. His matches he had with Eddie Guerrero, his matches he had with Rey Mysterio and Edge. These were the matches that was putting him on the map. He also was in a tag team for a brief little minute with Chris Jericho. They won a tag team championships together. So Chris Benoit was one of those leaders, man. He was a leader in the locker room. He definitely was one of those guys that put forth his best effort. He was a perfectionist. Anytime they say he used to botch or mess up in a match, he will go back there, in the back. He'll be doing squats and people will be wondering, what the heck are you doing? Why are you doing this? He's like, because I messed up. I mean, a guy that took himself extremely serious, took the business extremely serious, and took the fact that he was one of the best technical wrestlers and believed it very, very seriously. But Chris Benoit, once again, having classic matches, just like in WCW, but never got the opportunity to win the world championship. Now, he battled for the championship, the WWE championship a couple times, but he never won the championship. It was always close, but no cigars. I can remember a match on SmackDown where he fought Brock Lesnar, and it was a great match, but he ended up passing out to what was called the Brock Lock, when Brock Lesnar takes a person's leg and wraps it around his neck and bends them, and bends them really awkwardly, passes out to that. But once again, close but no cigars. So they end up having another draft. And at this particular time, like Chris Benoit still on SmackDown, he ends up going into the Royal Rumble, right? He ends up going into the Royal Rumble. This was back in 2004. And Chris Benoit, okay, who never was a part of the top tier in WWE to a point where people just said, we want that guy. He was up there, but he never really broke through the ceiling. Here he is coming to the Royal Rumble, and he ends up winning it all. I mean, he ends up winning the Royal Rumble, which was a shock to a lot of people because even though he put on a historical performance at that particular time, I don't think anybody expected him to win, especially when he was in there late with the Big Show. And he ends up eliminating the Big Show to win the Royal Rumble. So he ends up wanting to challenge Shawn Michaels and heavyweight champion at the time, Triple H, to a triple threat match at WrestleMania 20. And man, this was a good match. My goodness. Once again, a match that you want to see. Chris Benoit, Shawn Michaels, Triple H. Great match, man. I mean, it was almost to a point where you even thought that Chris Benoit, there was no chance that he was going to win this match. He ends up getting put through a table by Triple H and Shawn Michaels. He ends up getting back into the ring. He puts the crippler crawface on Triple H. Finally, he taps out. And Chris Benoit becomes the world heavyweight champion for the first time. Tears in his eyes, confetti flowing. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, in the ring comes Eddie Guerrero, who just retained his WWE championship against Kurt Angle later in the night. And these two guys embraced with a hug. Two guys that traveled the road together. Two guys that were always, the bridesmaids, but never the brides. Two guys that always seemed like they were just too small to be in that position. They're standing, holding two of the most prestigious championships in the ring together at the same time. It was a great moment. Not to mention, him and his family, getting in the ring, they hug and they embrace. They're happy for him. And, Chris Benoit held the championship for about 5 or 6 months, and he ended up losing at SummerSlam to a young, emerging Randy Orton, who became the youngest world heavyweight champion of all time. He had some good matches at the world heavyweight champion. He even won the tag team championship as well. So he had 2 titles during his time. So WWE was really trying to push Chris Benoit and make him a main event player. Once again, he lost to Randy Orton. But then, in the process, he ends up leaving Raw, going back to SmackDown. All right. He goes to SmackDown and he's still putting on some of these really good matches, man. He's up there putting on really good matches with some of the top talent that you can find. Right. But they end up having another draft. But this time, WWE decides to send him to a new developmental type territory that was ECW. You had a lot of these young wrestlers that was coming out of OVW, people that was coming up tough enough, and they wanted somebody to be a locker room leader to some of these guys. So Chris Benoit ended up going to ECW so he can help develop people like CM Punk and John Morrison at the time, and so many other young up and coming guys. Bobby Lashley is another guy. These were guys that the WWE really believed in, invested in, and they wanted them to go to the next level. And they wanted somebody that could really wrap their arms around them, let them know what they were doing wrong. So they elected Chris Benoit to take on this duty. But this where, things start to get a little bit weird. You know what I'm saying? Like, I have to backtrack because I have to bring this story to light. And, once again, I really don't want to talk about this, but it has to get talked about. Back in 2005, on November 2005, the WWE, the wrestling world, lost Eddie Guerrero. And keep in mind, I said at WrestleMania 20, these two guys embraced as world champions together. These guys traveled the road. They became best friends in the process. And Chris Benoit, the death of Eddie Guerrero, to me, this is just my opinion. I feel like the death of Eddie Guerrero really set up the moment of what happened towards the end of Chris Benoit's life. People were talking about how Chris Benoit really took the death of Eddie Guerrero. They said that he would be crying. I mean, just uncontrollably, you know what I'm saying? Like unconsolable crying. This guy like could not be consoled. People just, no matter what they tell him, it was just so hurtful to him. But, Chris Benoit, which I feel like what he should have did, he probably should have took some time off on the road, but he didn't. He just continued to work. And I don't think he really dealt with the death of Eddie Guerrero correctly. But, he ended up getting a journal. He received a journal from his wife for him to write down his emotions and how he felt. And, it was Chris Benoit actually writing in his journal every day as if he was writing to his best friend, Eddie Guerrero. And, it was a lot of issues that was going on behind the scenes, marital problems, what I'm saying, almost to a point where Chris Benoit and Nancy Benoit, also known as Woman, were about to get a divorce because she just couldn't deal with the attitudes, the mood swings, the frustration of Chris Benoit, and it got volatile. And I can remember Nancy Benoit's sister actually talking about this on previous interviews. She was just talking about how Nancy wanted to leave Chris for the very last time, and she was really fed up, and she did not want Chris to know where she was. But Chris ended up calling the sister, and he ended up like telling the sister, like, I made a mistake, this, that, and the third. I never do it again. So she ended up allowing Chris to get in touch with Nancy, and she said that's probably one of the biggest mistakes of her life. So we fast forward to a pay-per-view that was supposed to happen exclusively with ECW, where there was this ECW championship tournament. Chris Benoit was supposed to take on John Morrison in that tournament. Chris Benoit was supposed to take on CM Punk in that tournament. Okay, it was supposed to be this classic match between these two guys, and all of a sudden over the weekend, Chris Benoit was supposed to be at some shows, but he wasn't there, right? He wasn't, and this was very, very peculiar. And he got in touch with Chavo Guerrero, the nephew of Eddie Guerrero. He called him, well, he didn't call him, he texted him, and it was just sending him like all these type of cryptic messages talking about the dogs are locked up and all that kind of stuff. And also even gave him a phone call and said at the end, like, I love you. But Chavo says it like as if, he said it as if, what I'm saying, like something really was serious. So Chavo ended up calling him back, asking him, was he okay? And he was like, yeah. But he ended up sending like these messages. He also sends some messages to referee Brad Armstrong. And, they were like, man, what's going on here? So they end up getting in touch with WWE management, and they end up doing a wellness check. And, man, to everybody's dismay and everybody's shock, the Fayette, Georgia police goes there and they find Nancy Benoit, their son Daniel, and Chris Benoit all dead in the house, and they just put it as a suicide. But at the time, nobody knew about it. They did a tribute show on Monday Night Raw to Chris Benoit, right? A 3-hour show they did focusing on the life and the career of Chris Benoit. But then the next day, they found out that it was actually a murder-suicide. So Vince McMahon gets in front of the camera, apologizes, and said that he didn't know at the time. Nobody knew. We just thought it was right to do a tribute show to him, but we're not going to acknowledge Chris Benoit anymore besides me talking about him, giving you all this message. And that has been something that the WWE has been doing to the present time. Okay. Chris Benoit has passed away in 2007. He was, he did this horrific act back in 2007. It's been 13 years and the WWE still don't acknowledge him. I mean, if you look at, the WWE network, for a fact Chris Benoit wrestles on that particular pay-per-view. They don't even acknowledge it. They don't acknowledge him by name. Wrestlers, when they have interviews, they don't acknowledge him at all. So they really just completely wiped him out. And one person I feel really bad for, even though he's won the championship multiple more times than this, it has to be Randy Orton, because Randy Orton can't really talk about the time that he won his first championship because it involves Chris Benoit. And, I think that's very unfortunate for him, because if he starts to write his book or he does something with WWE later on down the line, he won't be able to really acknowledge Chris Benoit, and WWE doesn't want him to. So I think that's pretty sad that you're not going to be able to talk about how you felt the first time you actually had championship gold. But nevertheless, Chris Benoit, he did this horrific act. He's been wiped out. Nobody even mentions him in WWE anymore. And, there's always a topic that comes up and says, should Chris Benoit go to the WWE Hall of Fame? In my opinion, no. I don't think that you should be rewarded for what you did in your life if what you did at the tail end of your life is just so unforgivable. That was just absolutely horrible, man. I mean, for you to kill your wife, kill your young son, and then kill yourself, you can't get rewarded for that. I don't care what you did in life. I don't care how many classic matches that you have. You can't get rewarded for doing something that terrible, okay? I think we all can agree that, the WWE Hall of Fame isn't really just this, Hall of Fame like the NFL Hall of Fame, right? It's basically plug and play. It's basically WWE calling up a wrestler and putting them in there. You know what I'm saying? Like a lot of guys we see probably had middle of the pack type career there and there. It's just basically like, if you don't go to the WWE Hall of Fame, should you not be recognized as one of the best? As of right now, The Rock is not in the Hall of Fame. The Rock should easily be in the Hall of Fame right now, right? But they're holding off for that, right? Undertaker is going to eventually be in the Hall of Fame, but they're holding off for that. Kane is going to be in the Hall of Fame. Like guys like that, I'm pretty sure that eventually they're going to get a Hall of Fame, but at the same time, they still have great careers. Like, do we actually care? You know what I'm saying? We're still going to go to the WWE network. We're still going to go online, and we're still going to find these guys matches, and they're still going to be recognized as one of the best. Like I said at the beginning of this podcast, I separate the two. Chris Benoit was one of my favorite wrestlers, definitely top 5 favorite wrestler of all time for me. Okay, what he did in the ring. But I'm not going to lie to you, when I see his matches, a part of me kind of cringe, because in the back of my mind, I'm actually thinking about what he actually did to his family. And it just makes me feel like, in the back of my mind, am I supporting this guy? Like, am I, you know what I'm saying? Like, I shouldn't feel on the fence about watching your matches, okay? So I watch it, because I know it has some type of historic significance because I am watching it, but it's not the same, man. It's not the same. And I think a lot of people, if you're being real with yourself, a part of you has to think, if you're watching a Chris Benoit match, is it right or wrong? Okay, just like the group that actually made his theme song. They said they no longer are going to play his theme song because it's like almost like they're celebrating the guy. But to me, he's such a great wrestler, man. And some of his matches were just so good. And, I just try to, separate the two. But he doesn't belong in the Hall of Fame. And anybody out there that's lobbying for him to be in the Hall of Fame, I have to wonder sometimes, like, what's wrong with you? You know what I'm saying? Like, what is wrong with you? Like, we can't celebrate something like this because it was so pointless. It was so pointless, man. Like, no matter what you're going through in your life, why would you go out here and kill your wife and your son? Right? You know what I'm saying? I get it. You know what I'm saying? You're all messed up inside, but I would rather him do something to himself than innocent individuals that had absolutely nothing to do with your emotions. But we later found out, that Chris Benoit donated his brain to science. Chris Nowinski, who was a former WWE wrestler, had multiple concussions, decided to stop wrestling and focus on CTE and brain trauma. And Chris Benoit's father donated his brain to science, and they found out that he had, his brain was really screwed up, man. They said that he had the brain almost like a person that was 80 years old with Alzheimer's. And it explained a lot, man. And with that, Chris Benoit was able to help individuals, focus on CTE, how these concussions can really play a huge role in some of the decision making that people make. WWE, they don't want to talk about this. They don't feel like the research is correct. You had people that was a part of the news circuit. They were trying to say that this guy was just a pilled up, insane man. Nevertheless, man, brain trauma and what we know today, to me, it played a huge role in the decision making of Chris Benoit. But I just think that the loss of Eddie Guerrero really, I feel like Chris Benoit died the same day that Eddie Guerrero did. Maybe people didn't recognize it at the time, but he definitely did. That was his best friend. That's probably was the person that he went to with his problems. That probably was the person that he called, said, meet me down in the lobby, man. I'm going through a lot. Me and Nancy are going through this. That was probably his guy, man. And now that he didn't have him anymore, I just feel like he just didn't know where else to turn. Okay. You have other friends, right? Like you have friends, right? You got a circle, but there's always that one friend that you tell a little bit more to than you probably would tell the other friends. You're still friends with those guys, but there's that one connection that you may have with the other guy that you may not have with the others. And I just feel like that's what Chris had with Eddie. And, so all in all, the career of Chris Benoit, he had a great career, when we're talking about wrestling. He's going to go down in history as one of the greatest technical wrestlers of all time, one of the most intense wrestlers of all time, one of the most, scrappiest, one of the most dominant, physical guys of all time. But you can't talk about one story without the other. He's going to go down in history as one of the most disgraced wrestlers of all time because of what he did back in 2007 to his wife and his son. You can't talk about one without the other once again. And it's unfortunate, man, because can you imagine like some of the things that Chris Benoit can be contributing to the world of wrestling right now if he was still alive? He would be like in his 50s, if I'm not mistaken. He'll probably be maybe like 52 or 53 years old. So can you imagine like him being at the Performance Center helping young talent in NXT? Can you imagine him opening up his own wrestling school in Montreal, Quebec? Can you imagine like some of the matches that people can actually be looking at to help them hone their craft? Can you think about some of the things that he could have been doing in wrestling if none of this would have happened? Him and Eddie Guerrero, like the world lost something that day. You can afford me a few minutes. It reminds me of, they say there was this moment in history where they said the day the music died. It's when the Big Bopper, Buddy Holly, Jimmy Valiant, they all died in a plane crash, right? And some of you probably watched the movie La Bamba. You probably know what I'm talking about. But these guys were some of the most influential individuals in the world of rock and roll. And they got on a plane in a snowstorm to go to the next town to perform, and all of them died in a plane crash. And people call that time the day when the music died. To me, from 2005 to 2007, you can arguably say that was the time when the wrestling died, because these were two guys that really put technical wrestling on the map. They really did, man, and the physicality, because wrestling was never the same. With the loss of Eddie Guerrero, WWE started to taper down on the steroids and drug tests, policies and stuff like that. And with the death of Chris Benoit, you no longer seeing people taking shots to the head. You no longer seeing headshots. Most of the time, you see it to this day. You see wrestlers, exposing their back to their opponent, so the opponent can hit them in the back or hit them in the leg with the chair. So these two guys played a huge role in their death, to the world of professional wrestling. But Chris Benoit will go down in history as one of the greatest technical wrestlers of all time once again. But he is the most disgraced wrestler of all time. You can't have one without the other. But I want to say thank you all for checking out TJ Knows Wrestling Podcast. Thank you so much for your time. Please subscribe to the YouTube channel, youtube.com. Search The State. I got another podcast called The State of the Saints, but I'm all over the place. YouTube.com. Search TJ Knows Wrestling Podcast. TJ Knows Wrestling Podcast. Also, subscribe to the Facebook page, Facebook TJ Knows Wrestling Podcast. Thank you all so much. Tell me what you all think about Chris Benoit. Like, share, and comment on this video. Thank you so much, and I'll see you.